The Cuban Missile Crisis was a defining moment in the Cold War and one of the closest the world ever came to nuclear conflict. It lasted for 13 days in October 1962 and resulted in a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over the deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. But what if the Cuban Missile Crisis had failed? If the Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated into an all-out war, the consequences would have been devastating. The immediate aftermath would have seen the United States and Soviet Union engage in a full-scale nuclear exchange, with cities across the globe being reduced to ashes. The impact of such a conflict on humanity and the planet as a whole would have been catastrophic. The immediate effects of a nuclear war would have been widespread death and destruction. Within minutes of the first strike, millions of people would have been killed by the initial blast, fire, and radiation. Cities would have been reduced to rubble, and many more would have died in the days, weeks, and months that followed. The impact of the nuclear fallout would have been felt for generations, with the environment being contaminated and entire ecosystems being destroyed. The long-term consequences of a failed Cuban Missile Crisis would have had far-reaching and profound impacts on the global economy. In the immediate aftermath of a nuclear war, the destruction of major cities and infrastructure would have caused widespread disruption to production and transportation networks. With many key economic centers being destroyed, the global economy would have been thrown into chaos as countries struggled to rebuild and recover from the disaster. As production capabilities were severely impacted, the availability of goods and services would have been greatly reduced. The destruction of key infrastructure such as ports, roads, and airports would have disrupted trade and commerce, causing further economic upheaval. The loss of life would also have had a significant impact on the workforce, leading to a shortage of skilled labor and a reduction in the number of people able to participate in the economy. The global economy would have been further impacted by the long-term effects of nuclear fallout. The contamination of land and water sources would have made it difficult to grow crops and sustain livestock, leading to widespread food shortages. The impact of the war on the environment would have also caused major damage to natural resources, with many species becoming extinct and entire ecosystems being destroyed. This would have had a significant impact on industries such as fishing and forestry, causing further economic disruption. The economic consequences of a failed Cuban Missile Crisis would have been felt for centuries, as the world struggled to rebuild and recover from the devastating impact of the war. The rebuilding process would have been slow and costly as countries attempted to rebuild their infrastructure and restore their economies. This would have required significant investments in new technologies and the development of new production methods, further straining the global economy. The long-term impact of a failed Cuban Missile Crisis would have been felt by future generations, as the world struggled to rebuild and recover from the catastrophic events of the past. The global economy would have been left permanently scarred, with countries struggling to regain their former levels of prosperity and growth. The world would have been a vastly different place, with economic, political, and social structures being altered in ways that would have been impossible to predict. The global community would have been left to deal with the consequences of the failed Cuban Missile Crisis for generations to come. The political ramifications of a failed Cuban Missile Crisis would have been equally profound. The global balance of power would have been drastically altered, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the dominant powers in the world. The United Nations would have been left in tatters, with international cooperation and diplomacy being replaced by a new world order dominated by the two superpowers. In such a scenario, the arms race would have escalated to new heights, with both the United States and the Soviet Union developing and deploying more and more sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. The world would have been left in a state of permanent tension, with the threat of nuclear war hanging over humanity like a dark cloud. The global community would have lived in fear of another conflict, with the world becoming a more dangerous and unstable place.